At dawn on August 30th, 1776, the Continental Army was still disappearing from Brooklyn. British siege lines stood only about 600 yards from the American works. The East River remained the only route out, and several regiments had not yet reached the boats. Then a dense fog settled over the heights. Under its cover, Massachusetts mariners kept rowing while exhausted soldiers filed down to the ferry. When British troops finally entered the abandoned defenses, the army they expected to capture was gone. The British had won the largest battle yet fought in the Revolution. George Washington had nevertheless preserved the force on which the Revolution depended. How did an army that had been outmaneuvered, divided, and nearly surrounded escape across a tidal river under the eyes of a superior enemy? The answer was not one miraculous decision, and it was not the fog alone. It was a chain of events. British caution followed an earlier costly battle. Weather kept warships out of the East River. American boats, maritime skill, rearguard discipline, and a commander willing to abandon ground completed the opportunity. To understand the escape, the story must begin with the defeat that made it necessary. Only weeks earlier, on July 4th, the Continental Congress had adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document announced a political separation, but it did not create the military power needed to defend it. Britain still possessed the strongest sea in the Atlantic world and a professional army able to operate on a scale the new United States could not match. New York was the obvious place to demonstrate that advantage. Its harbor could support a great fleet. The Hudson River offered a route toward Canada. Control of the city could divide New England from the colonies farther south and give the British a secure base for the campaign to come. The British expedition began gathering off Staten Island in late June and early July. By the time reinforcements arrived, the force included more than 30,000 British and German soldiers, supported by hundreds of ships and roughly 10,000 sailors. Contemporary observers struggled to describe the sight. Masts crowded the lower harbor, transports filled the anchorages, and warships controlled the approaches. It was among the largest overseas forces Britain had yet assembled. The expedition was commanded on land by General William Howe and at sea by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. Together, they could move troops around New York faster than Washington could march them overland. Washington had about 19,000 men distributed across a broad defensive system, though illness, detached duties, and expiring enlistments reduced the number available at any one point. His army mixed Continental Regiments with militia and short-term levies. Some units had seen combat around Boston. Others had little collective training. Equipment and discipline varied widely. The problem was not a lack of courage. It was that Washington had to defend islands, rivers, roads, and a major city against an enemy able to choose its point of attack. Every position he reinforced left another one exposed. The geography made that dilemma severe. Manhattan lay between the Hudson and East Rivers. Across the East River, the village of Brooklyn stood behind a fortified line on Brooklyn Heights. Farther south and east, a wooded ridge known as the Heights of Guan crossed western Long Island. Roads passed through the ridge at several points, including Gowanus, Flatbush, Bedford, and Jamaica Pass. An army approaching Brooklyn from the south had to cross that high ground. If the Americans held the roads and watched the spaces between them, the ridge could delay a larger force. If one pass was left open, the ridge could conceal an enemy movement until it was too late. Washington did not know whether Howe intended to strike Manhattan or Long Island. He therefore divided his strength, keeping substantial forces on both sides of the East River. In retrospect, the
regiment will advance along the eastern road
thin.
and secure the river
At the
crossing
time,
by
it
dawn.
reflected a genuine intelligence problem. British ships could threaten several landing points, and surrendering New York without a fight carried political as well as military costs. Washington expected Manhattan to remain the principal objective, even after British troops began moving toward Long Island. That assumption shaped every reinforcement decision that followed. On August 22nd, British troops crossed the Narrows from Staten Island and landed around Gravesend Bay. About 15,000 came ashore during the first operation, and Howe's force on Long Island soon grew to roughly 20,000. The landing met little resistance. Washington sent additional regiments across the East River, but did not concentrate his entire army there. Around 10,000 Continentals and militia ultimately faced Howe on Long Island. Major General Israel Putnam held overall command in Brooklyn after illness removed Nathaniel Greene, the officer who had supervised much of the defensive preparation. The American advanced position followed the heights of Guam, but it did not reach Jamaica Pass on the far left. The defenders lacked enough men to fortify the whole ridge. Patrols were supposed to cover the gap and give warning. Washington knew the eastern approaches were vulnerable, yet the reconnaissance system remained weak. The army had few mounted scouts, command responsibilities were confused, and aggressive British light troops limited American movement. Local loyalists, meanwhile, provided Howe's officers with detailed information about roads and American positions. The British learned that the American left ended short of Jamaica Pass. They built their plan around that opening. Howe and General Henry Clinton chose a maneuver that combined deception with overwhelming force. General James Grant would demonstrate against the American right near the Gowanus Road. Lieutenant General Leopold von Heister and the German troops would threaten the center around Flatbush Pass. Those movements were intended to hold American attention on the obvious roads. The main column, about 10,000 strong, would march far around the eastern flank, pass through Jamaica Pass, and turn west behind the ridge. If the timing worked, the Americans would face pressure from the front, while the main British force closed on their rear and their route back to Brooklyn. The flanking march began on the evening of August 26th. British troops left their campfires behind and moved across unfamiliar roads under Loyalist guidance. Clinton led the advance, while Howe and General Charles Cornwallis followed with the main body. The column stretched for miles and brought artillery with it, yet American patrols did not detect the movement in time. Near Jamaica Pass, the British detained an innkeeper and his son and compelled them to guide an advance party. A handful of American militiamen guarding the area were captured. By early morning, the British held the pass without a significant fight. Before dawn on August 27th, firing began on the American right near the Red Lion Inn. Grant's troops advanced against Lord Stirling's command, which included the 1st Maryland and Delaware regiments. In the center, the German force waited near Flatbush for the signal to move. To American commanders on the ridge, these attacks appeared to confirm that the principal struggle would take place in front of them. The fighting fixed their attention westward and southward. Behind the trees to the east, Howe's main column was already moving into the position from which it could make the American line untenable. At about 9 in the morning, signal guns sounded. Heister's troops moved against the center as Howe's column came through the American rear. The operation was not a perfect double envelopment in the classical sense, but its effect was devastating. American units that had been oriented toward the south suddenly faced a much larger force on their flank and behind them. Roads and wooded slopes that had seemed to offer protection became channels of retreat. Some regiments maintained order for a time, others broke into scattered groups. Officers could no longer see or control much of the line. Washington crossed from Manhattan during the battle and observed part of the action from the Brooklyn works. He and Putnam tried to rally retreating soldiers, but the tactical problem could no longer be repaired from the rear. The immediate task was to recover as many units as possible before the British closed the approaches to Brooklyn Heights. Men moved through woods, across fields, and toward the Gowanus marshes. Some found roads back to the fortified line. Others were cut off, surrounded, or forced into difficult crossings through tidal water and mud. On the American right, Stirling's division had held Grant for several hours. Once Stirling understood that the flanking column threatened the Gowanus Road, he began withdrawing his main body. Elements of the Maryland and Delaware regiments turned to delay the British near the Courtalou House, later remembered as the Old Stone House. Their purpose was not to win the battle at that farmhouse. It was to keep a route open long enough for other soldiers to cross the marsh and reach Brooklyn. The action unfolded as a series of advances and withdrawals under pressure, not as one simple ceremonial charge. Later memory called these troops the Maryland 400. The exact number engaged in the covering action is difficult to fix, but roughly 400 Maryland soldiers were involved in the desperate fighting around the house and the Gowanus route. Maryland archival research identifies 256 men from the regiment as killed or captured during the battle, not 256 killed. Survivors also returned to the American lines in greater numbers than some popular retellings suggest. The distinction does not diminish what the regiment did. It replaces legend with the more credible fact that the unit accepted severe losses to help the larger force escape. Sterling himself was taken prisoner after the delaying action. Sullivan was also captured elsewhere on the field. Across the American line, losses were heavy and estimates vary. A recent United States Army history places American deaths at around 300, with more than 1,000 captured and an uncertain number wounded. Other summaries estimate roughly 650 wounded. British and German losses were far lower, about 350 to 400 killed, wounded, or missing. The imbalance reflected not only differences in training, but the success of the flanking maneuver and the disorder of the American retreat. By early afternoon, the British had driven the surviving Americans behind the Brooklyn fortifications.
The British regulars advanced across the muddy
before
field,
ordering an immediate
maintaining
assault
formation
on the
discipline
earthworks.
under fire.
This decision is often presented as the moment Britain lost the war. That claim goes beyond the evidence. Howe had just achieved a major victory, and his troops had advanced through difficult terrain after a long night march. The American defenses were formidable enough to impose risk. Only 14 months earlier, at Bunker Hill, British forces had taken more than 1,000 casualties in repeated frontal attacks against prepared positions.
Here we see
Howe
the engineers
chose siege
extending the
methods
siege
instead.
digging.
Engineers began digging parallels and saps toward the American line, while the Royal Navy prepared to close the East River. From the British perspective, the approach was rational.
Engineers
Washington's
widened
army
the trenches,
stood with its
lifting
back
heavy
to a tidal
spadfuls of wet
waterway.
earth and depositing
British
them into
warships
wicker baskets
controlled
for
the
the
harbour.
defensive work.
Time appeared to favour the besiegers, who could tighten the ring without paying the price of another frontal assault. Yet the methodical choice also granted Washington the one resource he urgently needed: time to recognise that holding Brooklyn was no longer worth the risk.
Even in the
Washington
trenches,
initially
camp duties
reinforced the
continued,
position.
while some soldiers
Through the 28th, more troops crossed from Manhattan until upward of 9,000 soldiers crowded behind the works. The added strength might help repel an assault, but it also increased the number who could be trapped. Supplies, ammunition, guns, horses, and wounded men all had to be considered. British trenches crept to within about 600 yards. The East River behind the Americans was not a calm channel. It was a tidal strait with strong currents, difficult even for experienced crews. If British ships entered it, an evacuation could become impossible. Then the weather changed the naval equation. A northeaster brought heavy rain and rising wind. The freshly worked earth
Brooklyn
turned
siege
to deep
lines held
mud
firm
and water
despite
collected
the
in the
relentless
trenches.
downpour.
The
East
same
River
wind
became a
that
tempest.
punished the soldiers
While the
made it
trenches offered
difficult for
scant
Admiral
protection from the
Howe's
sheeting
sailing
rain,
vessels
the naval
to move into
bombardment
the
was
East River
momentarily stayed
against the
by the
conditions. The river was not permanently open, and the Americans did not know how long the opportunity would last. But for the moment, the most dangerous British advantage, control of the water behind Brooklyn, could not be brought fully into place. On August 29th, Washington convened a council of war at the Philip Livingston House. The generals considered the position and unanimously supported evacuation. Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin, whose Pennsylvania troops would serve in the rear guard, strongly backed the plan. The decision marked a change in Washington's priorities. Brooklyn Heights had political and geographic value, but the army had greater strategic value. A lost position
The
could be
rear assembly
abandoned.
area
A
served as a
captured
vital
field
collection
army could
point
not
for
be
both
replaced.
supplies and
The question was whether thousands of men and their equipment could cross before the weather shifted or the British discovered the movement. The preparation required more than an order to retreat. Washington directed the Deputy Quartermaster General, Hugh Hughes, to collect suitable craft from the waterways north of the city and bring them to the Brooklyn Ferry. Boats already moving supplies across the East River were gathered with additional sloops, barges, and flat-bottomed vessels.
Crews
Orders
cast
within
off
the
the
army
shallow
were
draft
deliberately
craft from the timber
limited.
piers.
Many
The
officers
flatboat
were
cast
told to
off the wet
prepare their
timber
units
piers.
for
The
movement
Massachusetts
without being
maritime soldiers
informed that the
began rowing
entire
downstream
position would
towards
be
the Brooklyn
abandoned.
ferry route.
Secrecy reduced the chance that a deserter, civilian, or careless conversation would reveal the plan. The operation depended on 2 Massachusetts regiments with deep maritime experience. Colonel John Glover's 14th Continental Regiment drew heavily from Marblehead's community of sailors, fishermen, merchants, and maritime laborers. Colonel Israel Hutchinson's 27th Continental also included men familiar with North Atlantic work. Their ranks reflected the diversity of Massachusetts seaports, including white, black, and native soldiers. Surviving descriptions confirm that Glover's regiment included a notable number of black men, though precise proportions are uncertain. What mattered that night was not a romantic image of fishermen. It was practiced knowledge of tide, sail, balance, loading, and oars. By about 8 in the evening, troops began moving quietly toward the ferry. Campfires remained burning along the defensive line to preserve the appearance of an occupied position. Mifflin's rear guard stayed in the works, watching British trenches across the wet ground. Farther back, units moved by sequence rather than in a general rush. The mud was so deep that gun carriages sank nearly to their hubs. Soldiers and teams had to pull them free while limiting noise. The army intended to leave no usable artillery behind. The first loads included the wounded, heavy guns, ammunition, baggage, and livestock. Each category created a different problem. Cannon and wagons could overload small craft. Horses shifted their weight and could make a boat unstable. Infantry had to wait in formation, move to the landing at the proper moment, embark without crowding, and form again after reaching Manhattan. The work could not be hurried into disorder. A single accident would not necessarily expose the whole operation, but confusion at the narrow landing could delay every vessel behind it. The mariners worked with a mixed fleet. Some boats were broad and shallow, suitable for men, horses, and guns. Others depended on oars or small sails. The tide and northeast wind made the early crossings difficult. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of wind changes, but they agree that the crews repeatedly crossed under demanding conditions, and that the weather later became more favorable. Oars were muffled to reduce noise. Boats moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan, unloaded, and returned through darkness and rain for another group. This was not a crossing of an empty river. Currents pulled through the channel, vessels passed at different speeds, and the landing areas had limited space. Crews had to judge weight, keep bows aligned, and avoid collisions while carrying soldiers who were often cold, soaked, and sleepless. The work was repetitive but never routine. Every trip removed another piece of the army from the siege. Every return to Brooklyn committed the crew to another passage, while the British remained close enough that discovery could transform transport into a race under attack. At the front, the rear guard made the deception credible. Soldiers maintained the fires and occupied the parapets as though the full army remained behind them. Their role required restraint. Too little activity might invite investigation. Too much might suggest a change. They could hear movement behind the works, but could not abandon their position until ordered. The army's survival therefore depended on 2 synchronized rhythms, boats steadily clearing the waterfront and troops at the line maintaining an ordinary night under siege. Confused orders nearly disrupted that balance. At one point, troops assigned to the rear began moving toward the ferry before they were supposed to leave. Accounts described them being directed back to the works until the remaining units had crossed. The episode reveals how fragile the operation was. This was an 18th century army moving at night through rain and mud, without radios, electric lights, or a central transport schedule visible to every commander. Orders traveled by aides and word of mouth. The retreat succeeded because errors were corrected before they became visible to the enemy. As the night advanced, the scale of the task remained daunting. The boats had to carry not only infantry but field pieces, heavy ordnance, ammunition, provisions, horses and cattle. Glover's and Hutchinson's men made repeated trips. Officers on both shores counted units and tried to keep the flow moving. Washington stayed near the ferry, supervising embarkation rather than withdrawing early. The darkness that concealed the work was beginning to fade, and soldiers still remained in Brooklyn. If daylight exposed the emptying fortifications, British infantry could advance while the last regiments were concentrated near the water. That was when the fog became decisive. Benjamin Tolmadge, then a young Continental officer, later remembered a dense fog settling over the encampments. In a memoir written decades afterward, he said visibility fell to only a few yards and remained poor even after sunrise. His account must be treated as later recollection, but the presence of heavy morning fog is supported by the broader record. It masked the final movement from the American lines to the ferry and limited what British observers could see. Weather had first restricted the fleet. It now obscured the last stage of the land evacuation. The final units left after sunrise. Washington is widely reported to have remained until the end, and later accounts describe him taking one of the last boats. By about 7 in the morning, roughly 9,000 troops had reached Manhattan, along with artillery, ammunition, horses, cattle, and provisions.
The
crossing had taken about 9 hours from the first organized movement, though preparations and related transfers extended the operation beyond that interval. The British did not interrupt it. When their patrols entered the works, they found fires still burning and a position stripped of the army and equipment they had expected to seize. The escape was complete, but it did not reverse the battlefield result. Howe had won a clear victory on Long Island. British forces had exposed serious weaknesses in American reconnaissance, command organization, and battlefield discipline. They had taken more than 1,000 prisoners and inflicted losses the Continental Army could ill afford. Within weeks, the British captured New York City and held it until the war's end in 1783. Washington's army would retreat again, first through Manhattan and then across New Jersey, as enlistments expired and confidence declined. Yet the British victory remained tactically decisive without becoming strategically final. Howe had gained ground, prisoners, and a major port. He had not captured Washington's main army. That distinction mattered because the revolution depended less on holding any single city than on maintaining an organized force in the field. As long as the Continental Army existed, Congress could claim that resistance continued. Britain still had to pursue it, protect supply lines, garrison territory, and convert battlefield success into lasting political control. The evacuation denied Howe the simplest path to that larger objective. It is tempting to say that one more British attack, one change in the wind, or one morning without fog would certainly have ended the revolution. History cannot establish that counterfactual. Capture of much of Washington's force would have been a severe, perhaps devastating blow, but resistance also existed through state governments, local militia, Congress, and other continental formations. The honest conclusion is narrower and stronger. The Brooklyn Army was central to the rebellion's military capacity in 1776, and preserving it prevented a catastrophic defeat from becoming an immediate strategic collapse. The men saved at Brooklyn soon demonstrated the value of survival. Continental troops fought at Harlem Heights in September, offering a needed local success after the New York defeats. They continued northward as Howe maneuvered around Manhattan, then withdrew through New Jersey under heavy pressure. In December, Washington struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. Maritime soldiers associated with Glover again helped move troops across difficult water during the
preparing for
Delaware
advance on the
operation.
objective.
Trenton did not erase Long Island, but it showed why keeping the army intact had mattered. Washington also carried lessons from the campaign, though not as a simple overnight transformation.
The
He
objective was
remained
the river
capable of
crossing,
error and
secured
would
by the
again
flanking
face
maneuver.
disputes over when to
This allowed the
defend or
main force to
withdraw.
consolidate.
But New York
must move the
reinforced a
main
strategic
contingent
habit that
across the
became
river
increasingly
before the thaw.
important. The army could surrender
position is
ground while
critical
preserving
for the
its
spring
ability to
offensive.
operate. Washington learned to weigh cities and positions against the survival of the force. He relied
This
more
river
on
crossing is
movement
critical.
and recognized
By
that
moving the
Britain's
unit
tactical
here,
power
we secure
did
the
not
flank against the
automatically
approaching
produce
enemy
political
markers.
submission. The British, too, faced a problem more complicated than a missed chance at Brooklyn. Howe's caution reflected real experience and a reasonable desire to conserve professional troops. His army could defeat Washington in open battle, occupy ports, and disperse defenders. It could not be everywhere at once. Each victory created new territory to guard. Each advance lengthened communications and required cooperation between army and navy. The escape across the East River did not reveal British incompetence. It revealed the limits of converting conventional military superiority into the destruction of a mobile rebellion. Memory later simplified the episode into heroic images. The Maryland
tactical movement
400
required
charged at
precise
the old
timing.
stone house.
The
Marblehead fishermen rowed in silence. Washington left on one of the final boats, while providential fog hid an army. Each image contains a basis in the record, but each also needs restraint. The Marylanders suffered severe losses, yet more survived than legend sometimes allows. Glover's regiment played a crucial role, but other mariners and boat crews participated. The fog mattered, but preparation, transport, discipline, and British choices had already made escape possible. That fuller account gives the operation greater weight, not less. The retreat worked because many separate parts remained aligned under pressure. Scouts and commanders had failed before the battle, but quartermasters then found boats. Defeated regiments recovered enough order to move by sequence. Rearguard troops held their position while comrades passed behind them. Sailors and fishermen applied civilian skills to a military emergency. Washington accepted the political cost of abandoning Brooklyn and stayed to supervise the risk he had ordered others to take. The central question, then, is not how a miracle erased an American defeat. Nothing erased it. The question is how a defeated army escaped the consequences its enemy expected to impose. Howe chose siege over assault, weather-delayed naval closure. American officers gathered craft, maritime regiments controlled the crossing, and the rear guard sustained the deception. Fog covered the final departures. No single factor was sufficient. Together, they transformed a trapped position into an organized withdrawal. Britain won Brooklyn and kept New York. The Continental Army lost men, equipment elsewhere in the campaign, and much of its early confidence. But on the night of August 29th, it preserved the one asset without which no recovery was possible: its continued existence as an army. The silence and fog endured in memory because they made the escape visible as a story. Beneath them lay the deeper military lesson. Survival was not the opposite of victory. For a weaker force facing a stronger empire, survival could be the condition that made any future victory possible.